Treasurer, fellows and guests, good evening. Can you hear me clearly? Excellent. During a recent conversation with one of my neighbours in Wales, my neighbour volunteered the observation that on a trip to Naples, the thing that had really impressed her was the English alabaster altarpiece in the Capodimonte Museum. Now, I imagine the archaeologists among you will be pretty horrified at this. It's certainly not something you hear every day. The interesting thing, though, I think, is that my neighbour, who is a very intelligent and highly educated person, but not particularly skilled in the arts, saw something in this altarpiece that I think many no longer see. The alabaster altarpiece is one of very few to survive intact, and certainly one of the most spectacular. That it's so little known, I think, is symptomatic of the indifference to English alabaster that still prevails, despite, I think, a flurry of interest more recently. So let me introduce you to it, those of you who don't already know it. Materially, it's a very expensive, rich altarpiece. Look, for example, at the framing. You can see that there is not just the customary framing that we're used to in alabaster altarpieces, but stained glass. The pigment that is used for the frame is azurite, which is expensive, and there's quite a bit of it used. And this is overlaid with gilded wooden decoration in a kind of stylised fleur-de-lis design. And it's tempting to connect that with the Angevin dynasties in Naples, but the dates don't work, unfortunately. I think this altarpiece is later than René of Anjou, the last Angevin ruler. So let's just take that as decoration. We have special effects. The tomb of Christ is painted in red and black, I think to simulate marble or maybe porphyry. And we have rich polychromy, which is the original polychromy. The altarpiece has been conserved and looks particularly stunning now. Now, you'll see the polychromy is partial, but nevertheless very colourful. And there is a great deal of gilding. Look, for example, at the skirt of the figure on the left, which is actually painted with little gold faces with their tongues sticking out, which look unnervingly like the assailant on the right of the compartment. So I think there's an element of narrative comedy here as well. If we look at the flesh tones, these are also used in a narrative way. So very highly coloured faces for the baddies, so to speak, and for the good people, the goodies, we have very sparing use of polychromy, for example, in the face of Christ, just a little highlighting what one conservator that I know memorably calls makeup. It's also an altarpiece that is suffused with virtuosity. If you know alabaster, this is an altarpiece to make you gasp. It does what seems to be impossible. Alabaster is easy to carve and it's just as easy to break. But this is full of details that remain extraordinarily unbroken. Look, for example, at the curved chair of Pilate, which stands proud of the actual body of Pilate and also of the compartment and is carved very thin and beautifully curved. Look at the leg of the assailant, which is proud of the block of the compartment, freestanding in effect, very vulnerable to damage and yet still okay. And the scrolls in Christ before Pilate, I'll come back to those. All of these are details which were incredibly difficult to carve. Just to give you a couple more actually, the crown of thorns held aloft on a pitchfork in Christ carrying the cross, and the winding lock of Mary Magdalene's hair, again carved independently of the figure, very, very detailed, very fragile, a tour de force of carving. This is also an altarpiece to make you think. There are these scrolls in Christ before Pilate are inscribed with biblical texts, so somebody close enough to the altarpiece could read those texts and remind themselves of the biblical story. Now, it's normal to have inscriptions below an altarpiece, but to have inscriptions actually on scrolls within an altarpiece like this is far less common, and I think shows the kind of level of audience that it was appealing to. The altarpiece also includes fashionable details, and I'm thinking here particularly of the soul of the good thief being taken away by an angel in the crucifixion, and on the other side there's the corresponding soul of the bad thief being carried off by a devil. Now this is a detail that I think you can track back to crowded crucifixions in Italy in the 14th century, and it filters through to Northern Europe around 1400. This is probably mid-15th century, and it's picking up on this rather popular iconography, at least popular on the continent. And of course this is an exported altarpiece. It's an altarpiece that seems to have been in Naples for a very long time indeed, and maybe the iconography was even devised partially with that in mind. I've come across that with other alabaster carvers, gearing their iconography to a fairly cosmopolitan market. Mary Magdalene is extraordinary not just for her winding lock of hair, but for what it suggests. It reminds us of the conflation of Mary Magdalene with with the woman in the house of Simon the Pharisee, who washes Christ's feet with her tears and dries them with her hair. So it adds a level of meaning here. And I think the same is done in the resurrection, with the cloth behind Christ and the angels behind the cloth, which remind us of Christ as a man of sorrows, adding another layer of meaning on top of the resurrection narrative itself. So, we have a very impressive altarpiece. We also have a commercially competitive altarpiece. If I compare this with a Netherlandish carved wooden altarpiece of approximately the same date, and I've chosen one that's in England, one that's in Arundel Castle, I think you can see many similarities. Both are composed of a series of intricate narrative scenes, carved in high relief, but with the figures stacked up to give an illusion of space. Both are an inverted T shape, and they're both in triptych form with carved shutters. In the case of our alabaster altarpiece, you can see the join here where the shutters close over the centre. The shutters are alas gone in the Arundel altarpiece, but the hinge marks are still there, and you can see that there used to be some. Both altarpieces have lost their little upper shutters, which would have closed over the central section, but again the hinge marks show that they were originally there. So a very similar format. And the Naples altarpiece is not absolutely, it's hard to say what is typical of an English alabaster altarpiece because we have lots of bits and not many holes. But certainly not all of the surviving alabaster altarpieces follow this inverted T-shaped format, and I think it's particularly interesting that this one, designed for an Italian market, was. Now, what's the point of this comparison? Really, it's to say that English alabasters and Netherlandish carved altarpieces have a very similar trajectory. They were both produced for export, they were both very popular on the continent, and they were often competing for exactly the same markets. What I don't want to be suggesting is that English alabasters in any way copied Netherlandish carved altarpieces. I think there was undoubtedly some kind of jostling between the two, and it wouldn't have been difficult for that to happen. We know that Netherlandish carved altarpieces came to England. We know that English alabasters were sent to the continent. So there was every reason, really, for carvers who wanted to keep their place in the market, to keep on their toes and to learn from each other. So the similarities here with the case, the tracery, the triptych format and so on, I think maybe partly a response to that on both sides. The Netherlandish carved altarpiece to English alabasters, the English alabaster altarpiece to the Netherlandish one. So yes, a commercial product, but here a very, very high status one. So why isn't this altarpiece better known? Well, maybe you all do know it, but I saw it only relatively recently, I have to confess. I think one of the main reasons why English alabasters have never attained a canonical status in modern art history is because of their resolute repudiation of naturalism. Now, the canons of 15th century art were set up really by Vasari, and it's an irony that this altarpiece comes from San Giovanni Carbonara, from the sacristy, which was lined with paintings by Vasari. So the two were face to face, Vasari with his canon of 15th century mores that the altarpiece resolutely refused. to fit in with, and it's a double irony that the Vasari paintings got destroyed in World War II and the altarpiece is still with us. So hooray for that. I think it's fair to say that English alabasters have always struggled in comparison with their continental counterparts, whether Italian or Netherlandish. This was the judgment of the 1987 Age of Chivalry exhibition. The English alabaster industry, a small-scale, low-price enterprise based near the alabaster quarries in the North Midlands, cannot really be compared in importance with the leading luxury goods industries of the continent. I hope I've challenged that. I think they can, and I think the rich Naples altarpiece doesn't really square with this judgment. I've been working on alabaster for a number of years now, but starting with continental alabasters and coming relatively late to the English side of things. Now that's got its disadvantages. There's a great deal of scholarship to catch up on, a great deal of knowledge to fill in, but it also gives you a bit of an advantage because you're coming from a different perspective. So what I've hoped to do is just to have a fresh look at some of the things that we know very well about English alabasters and see what they look like if you look at them slightly differently. I'm not claiming huge advances in the field, but I'm hoping that some of the things that I talk about this evening, some of which are new ideas, some of which are new findings, will at least help to start a conversation for English alabasters taking the position in art history that I think they deserve, if only because of their importance and popularity at the time, which is undeniable, I think. So I'm going to start where everybody starts, with the tomb, with the tomb of Edward II. Now, I'm sure that you all know about this tomb. It is the first example of an English alabaster effigy. When Edward II either died or was murdered, depending on which line you take, he was buried in an out-of-the-way place, St Peter's Abbey in Gloucester, which is now the Cathedral. Legend has it that offerings at his grave were sufficient to finance a rebuilding programme that began under Abbot Wigmore, who died in 1337. This was probably an ancestor tomb, and you can still see the outline of the figures now gone underneath the bracket on the north side. You can see the fixings and the base as well. There were also nail holes for coats of arms, so I think it was an early example of an ancestor tomb in England. And famously, it has the first alabaster effigy and also the splendid canopy above, which trumps anything that had been seen in English or French tomb production before this date. So what do we make of this? Well, what has been suggested before, and which I thoroughly agree with, is that parallels have been drawn with the lustrous French tombs of the royal kings and queens of France, beginning with the effigy of Isabella of Aragon, dating from 1275 in Saint-Denis, and that of her husband, Philip the Bold, which was installed in 1307. So very early examples. Now, I think what's important about these French precedents is the lustrous combination of black and white. There's no polychromy on them now, and indeed the black tomb slabs tend to have gone missing as well. Most of the ones that are now there are replacements. But the contrast of white marble and black marble with sparing polychromy, which chronicles tell us was mainly gilding and blue, the heraldic colours of France. I think this would have given a very distinctive look, which would have identified the tombs very strongly as French, as people became used to them. It was a visual culture that was very distinctive and, crucially, easily copied. Now, I'm not suggesting that that's what Edward II's tomb was doing, in fact, quite the reverse. It's like enough to the French lustrous tombs for you to get the point. But it's also very different. Purbeck marble instead of black marble. This extraordinary canopy instead of the usual testers or more modest canopies of French tombs. So it's like a kind of take on a French tradition, but it's distinct from it. And that's a theme that I think we see elsewhere in 14th century English art. The first finding is nothing to do with me. It's scholarship that dates from the last few years, and some of you may already be aware of it. The tomb has been conserved, and one of the surprises was to find inside the tomb an earlier tomb, which is what you see at the top here. So this is a plain tomb chest with a Purbeck marble lid. So it's quite a very plain tomb, but materially it's a very rich one. So it would have been perfectly okay. Now, on one level, this isn't a surprise. I think everybody thought that there would have been some kind of temporary tomb before the elaborate tomb that we see today was actually made. The question that this begs is whether it was actually a temporary tomb, or whether this was actually what was intended. After all, Edward I had a plain tomb, a relatively plain tomb with a Purbeck lid and no effigy. So we can no longer be sure, I think, that anything more splendid was originally envisaged for Edward II. You can see from the diagrams, I only copied a few of them to give you an idea of the way in which the elaborate tomb is built around this inner core. But the Purbeck marble is actually buried. They didn't take it off, they just left it there. So when did this happen, and why did it happen? There is no documentation to help us here, and traditionally the tomb has always been dated very early. Temporary tomb, then replaced. Originally, people claimed before 1330, when Edward III took the reins. It's crept a little bit later, because I think now most people think that Edward III was probably the impetus behind the new tomb. I'd just like to throw out the question, really, how this looks if it dates later than that. We don't really, oh yes, this is the reconstruction of the polychromy, which I think is very interesting because it does look even more like an English counterpart to the French. So rather than have gold and blue, the French colours, we have gold and red, the Plantagenet colours. And if this is correct, it's more heavily painted. And actually, I think that is consistent with the English tomb tradition in alabaster in England. I think they generally were more heavily painted than sometimes on the continent. So we don't really have a terminus antiquem for Edward II's tomb any more than we have documents of its making, but there are some indications. And the first is the tomb of John of Eltham in Westminster Abbey. There is a document of 1339 where Isabella asks her son Edward III to move the body of John to a place that's more fitting for his status, and the tomb has always been assumed to date from after then, so maybe 1340 onwards, something like that. And you can see that originally, when the canopy, which actually turned out to be a rather lethal canopy and had to be dismantled, when the canopy was still there, that it would have looked much more like the tomb of Edward II. So the chronology has always been Edward II starts the alabaster tradition, and it's picked up in John of Eltham. But there's nothing about John of Eltham to push back the tomb to 1330. If it's a little later, then it begins to creep close to the outbreak of war with France in 1337, and this oppositional stance that it takes, alluding to French tomb approaches and yet clearly differentiating and trumping them, I think begins to make a little bit more sense. So I just leave that out there as a possibility. But there's something else that I think is playing into the tomb of Edward II, and that is the tomb of Robert the Bruce in Scotland. This is a fragment of it, or at least we think it is. Robert the Bruce is documented to have commissioned his tomb in his lifetime in Paris. It was being made probably in 1327 and reached Scotland and was installed just after his death. So a very deliberate choice on his part. The documents say that it's of alabaster. It's actually of white marble, but that's a very common conflation of the two materials in the 14th century that I won't go into now, but I can pick it up if you want me to. So, and there are little bits of black marble found as well, so it looks as if it was a very French-looking tomb with this chromatic contrast of white and red. It was being made in Paris at exactly the same time that there was a big royal commission going on. Charles IV commissioned tombs of his father and his two brothers. They went through kings rather quickly in France at this point, so they had three tombs kind of piling up on one another. So they were commissioned as a job lot and are now lost, but known through the Gagnère drawings. The obvious conclusion to draw is that Robert's would have looked something like these. And I'm not the only one that thinks so. There has now been a reconstruction done in Glasgow, which is very much based on the Guenière drawings and on these tombs that were being made in Paris at the time. Charles IV, incidentally, was added to the bundle as well because he died almost as soon as he actually placed the commission. So 4 tombs then being made in Paris. This is quite important, I think. And I don't think it's as well known as it needs to be, despite the exhibition. What I think Robert the Bruce was doing was borrowing cultural prestige by borrowing the material culture of the French. And this is why I think it's so important, the distinctive look of French tombs, which was easily imitated. And Robert does that absolutely here, I think. So it sets him, a usurper really, a little ruler, and a very contested one at that, on the European scale, on the European stage rather. But what does it do for Edward II? Well, you'll recall that Edward II had had a terrible defeat at the Battle of Bannockburn back in 1314, and his assailant was Robert the Bruce. Edward II was buried in a very simple tomb chest with a Purbeck marble top, and that is all that there was, because I think what these documents show with virtual certainty is that Robert the Bruce's tomb dates before Edward II's. It has to, and the documents, I think, tell us that. So the English, when they learned of this, would have been faced with the prospect of the usurper Robert the Bruce, the defeater and humiliator of England, having this fancy French tomb, and Edward II in a plain Purbeck marble one. Again, I just leave that with you, but it's hard not to see the elaborate tomb of Edward II, at least in part, as an effort to put that right. Now, what I think you see after the tomb of Edward II is a flurry of alabaster commissions in the reign of Edward III. I think materials matter. I think that's what we're seeing, that the materials convey a culture and can help to create a kind of dynastic look, whether French or English. And in the reign of Edward III, the royal tombs are alabaster. First, I've mentioned John of Eltham. Edward III's son, William of Hatfield in York Minster, is alabaster. Isabella of France, his mother, commissioned an alabaster tomb from Agnes Ramsay in her lifetime. And then the next tomb I want to look at is the tomb of Philippa of Hainault, Edward's wife, which again is of alabaster. But this, like the tomb of Robert the Bruce, was commissioned in France. And there's some new scholarship again that I think affects the way that we look at this. The payment to Jean de Liège of 200 marks in 1366 in January has long been known. It's often represented as 1367, it's actually 1366, but it's been out there for a long time. It's been assumed up until now that Jean de Liège came to England to make this tomb, and there have been all sorts of stories woven around this, that he brought people with them. André Bonnevat is one of the people that's been mentioned, that they may have stayed on, that they may have trained English carvers. It now looks as if this could all be wrong. Mark Ormerod and Christopher Govan Wilson both highlighted a payment made somewhere between 1364 and the 1st of February 1365 by the Countess of Pembroke in Paris in connection with the making of the Queen's tomb. So at this date, Jean de Liège was definitely still in Paris. And since the tomb was delivered in January, or at least paid for in January 1366, there wouldn't have been much time for him to come over the Channel and to start work. So the obvious conclusion is that, like the tomb of Robert the Bruce, and now that we know about that, it's far easier to believe now that the tomb was actually made in Paris, not in England at all. Jean de Liège may never have set foot in England, for all we know. He may have come to install the tomb, but he may equally have sent an assistant. That was an established practice as well. We don't know. But it's a French tomb and an import, like Robert the Bruce. Now, the second thing to say is the materials. In some of the literature, it's described as marble, and in some of the literature, it's described as alabaster. The marble refers to Jean de Liège, who customarily does work in white marble. It's perfectly true, and that's what you would expect. The conservators of Westminster Abbey very kindly tested this tomb at my request, and it actually is alabaster. So there we have an even weirder scenario, because the obvious place to get the alabaster from is England. It's the closest source for France. And we also have a document that has long been mysterious, because Philippa in 1362 arranged for the delivery of 6 carts of alabaster from Tutbury to London, and we've never known what they were for. So I wonder now whether this was the first planning for the tomb, and the alabaster was actually shipped over to France for Jean de Liège to work on. It's a possibility. A lot of this is about possibility, but I think we have to shift the way that we look at this tomb and see it as an import, not as something that was made in England. I couldn't resist putting the little mourner on the screen as well. Most of the mourners around the tomb have gone, but this one survived because it was shielded by the tomb of Henry V, which is butted up against it. And if you crawl into a hole, you can still see it. And it's the most magical little figure holding a monkey. So what I'm getting at is that alabaster serves as a kind of cultural signifier for the reign of Edward III. And there is a further bit of evidence that I'd like to cite to back it up. Again, it's long been known, but I don't think been pulled together in quite this kind of an argument. And that's the alabaster altarpiece for the Garter Chapel at Windsor. Now, it's just a blank slide because it's long lost and we don't really know what it looks like. There are no drawings of it, there are no descriptions of it. There isn't even a dedication. We don't even have a description that it's a crucifixion altarpiece, for example, or anything. All that we know is that it was alabaster. It was commissioned in 1367 from Peter the Mason, a Nottingham craftsman, and it cost 300 marks, which is actually the same that Jean de Liège was paid for Philippa's tomb, if we haven't missed another payment. 200 marks in January 1366 and 100 marks paid in Paris by the Countess of Pembroke. The altarpiece was dragged to Windsor by road in 10 carts, each pulled by 8 horses, so it was a colossal structure, whatever it looked like. Now, the question to ask, I think, is why alabaster? This is a royal commission, a very high-profile chapel. The obvious thing to do would be to choose a precious metal altarpiece, something with material richness. And this doesn't happen. Alabaster is chosen, again, apparently, for the first time in England, just as it was used for the first time in Edward II. So I got to thinking why this decision might have been made. The comparison between the Garter Chapel and the Sainte-Chapelle is something that has been talked about in some very fine scholarship on Windsor. Even more so in St Stephen's Chapel, obviously because it's a 2-storey thing, but nevertheless there are parallels with St George's Chapel as well. It had a college of canons of exactly the same number. It had a relic of the True Cross to counterpart the relic of the Crown of Thorns. So parallels, but the Sainte-Chapelle didn't have an alabaster altarpiece. It had a precious metal altarpiece, or at least structure. So what is this about? Well, I can't answer that definitively, but it does seem that the Sainte-Chapelle did have a white marble altarpiece, and these genres certainly dated earlier in France than they did in England. They're tracked back to about 1325 in France, and this in 1367 is the first record we have of one in England. So yet again, it looks like an English take, an English oppositional take on a French model. And if we have alabaster, a material that's particularly associated with the reign of Edward III and associated with royal culture, then it begins to make a little bit more sense. It's true that Windsor wasn't necessarily the first work of its kind. I think it was almost certainly the same work, the first of that scale. I can't imagine many people could command all those carts and horses. But there is a record in 1368 of an altarpiece with images made of alabaster in Swanton Abbot in Norwich, for example. So I think it's possible that the genre was beginning to trickle through into England already, but really came to prominence again with Edward III. And next, we see the material filtering out to the entourage of Edward III. And there are any number of examples that you could give here, but I chose 3 bishops who are particularly associated with him. Archbishop Stratford, who was instrumental in bringing Edward to the throne and and helping with the deposition of Edward II. Bishop Eddington, who was Treasurer and Chancellor for Edward III, and Bishop Hatfield in Durham, who is famous for riding into battle at the Battle of Crecy and defending the Black Prince. So very closely associated with the crown, and again using alabaster. But I think there is another part to the story, and again I'm using documents that are well known, but I think something has not been pulled out as it might have been. We associate alabaster primarily with knights' tombs. There are loads of them. You trip over them in all sorts of parish churches in England. Maybe we've become too used to them. There is a very famous case of 3 knights who wanted look-alike tombs. And you see one of them on the screen, Sir Richard Pembridge, which survives in Hereford Cathedral. Now this is of alabaster and it's in very good condition. The polychrome is all gone, but other than that, it seems to be in its original condition. Pembridge requested in his will a tomb like that of Sir John Beauchamp in Old St Paul's. And Sir Walter Morney, in his will in 1371, requested the same. And crucially, Morney stated that the tomb should be alabaster. Now, Pembridge doesn't mention alabaster, but it is alabaster. Morney requests alabaster, and the little bits that have been recovered from the Charterhouse seem to suggest that that's correct. So the inescapable conclusion is that John Beauchamp's was alabaster too. We know what that one looks like. There is an etching that survives of it, and it is very like the Pembridge tomb. The only difference that I could really spot, the only significant difference, is that his head is on a cushion rather than on a helm. But other than that, the tomb chest particularly is very similar. So 3 look-alike knights' tombs, apparently all of alabaster. Now the 3 look-alikes have been highlighted before, but the alabaster I think is crucial. These are the beginnings, I think, of a kind of band of brothers of the battles of Crecy and Poitiers, heroes of the French wars, which all of these 3 figures were, and many more of the 14th century knights who were commemorated by alabaster tombs. That seems to be what unites them. And I think there are 2 things to be said here. One is that alabaster has a symbolic significance which might be important. There is a work, a 15th century allegorical work called The Court of Sapience, which claims that alabaster white giveth victory. And this is referring back to a text from the English Franciscan Bartholomeus Anglicus in the text De Proprietatibus Rerum, which was widely known. And Bartholomeus says that alabaster has the power to bring victory and engenders and preserves friendship. Well, what better material to choose for this band of comrades, the veterans of Crecy and Poitiers, but a material associated with both victory and friendship? It's hard to believe that somewhere along the line somebody did not know of that symbolism. But I don't think that that is all. The knights' tombs, so far as we can tell, seem to emerge in the 1360s, and this coincides with John of Gaunt inheriting the Duchy of Lancaster through his wife Blanche. Henry of Lancaster dies in 1361. By 1368, Blanche was also dead, and John of Gaunt has control of the whole of the Duchy of Lancaster. And this includes the heartlands in the Midlands, which includes the alabaster quarries, both of Tutbury and of Chellaston, particularly of Tutbury, but we think Chellaston also. Now, I'm not suggesting that John then began handing out slabs of alabaster, but it does seem a coincidence that the material starts to be very much more widely used just as he inherits those territories. So the suggestion is, I think, that there is a connection, that the exploitation of alabaster in connection with these war heroes somehow is linked with John of Gaunt becoming the Duke of Lancaster. John of Gaunt's own tomb was of alabaster, dating from 1374. Again, it was in Old St Paul's and is now only known through drawings. It has another wonderful canopy, rather similar to that of Edward II. Now, you could argue that this is just part of the kind of material culture of Edward III. All of the royal family tombs tend to be alabaster in the reign of Edward III, so is this one. But the fact that this was Gaunt's own material, effectively, that he was overlord of the territories where alabaster was quarried, I think makes a difference. And the only other monarch to be represented in alabaster, to have an alabaster effigy, is, of course, Gaunt's son, Henry IV, in Canterbury Cathedral. Now, this has been seen as a cheap tomb, alabaster chosen because it cost considerably less than the brass that had been used for Richard III and Edward III. I'm not sure. I think it's just as possible that that by this stage, alabaster was in some sense a Lancaster material. And again, I'm not the first to suggest this, but I think that we have some evidence, really, if we look carefully at the trajectory and development of the tomb production. Henry IV's half-brother, John Beaufort, had already been buried in Canterbury Cathedral when Henry IV died, and he and Henry IV's son Thomas, Duke of Clarence, were also commemorated in alabaster, and there were other members of the family that were commemorated in alabaster too. But I think what you can also see is that of all this myriad of knights' tombs, a vast number of them have the SS collar, that they are Lancaster men. And the one I always show at this stage is Sir John Swinford. Now, who was he? Nobody in particular, really. He did fight in the French wars, so from that point of view, he fulfills the criteria, but he was hardly a war hero. He didn't have any great local importance, no real claim to fame that anybody's been able to uncover. In fact, his identity in the tomb is even contested. But he does wear the very earliest SS collar that has been traced in anything. And he died in either 1370 or 1371. There's a bit of a dispute about that, but it's certainly very early to find an SS collar. So this is the first example that there is. And he was a Lancaster man. Both he and his father-in-law fought for John of Gaunt. And the name, well, Alison Weir thinks that he was related to Catherine Swinford. And all of these things might perhaps be brought together to explain this quite extraordinary tomb of an otherwise very unimportant man who had no direct descendants to commission it, and who seems to have had no particular claim to fame, even locally. So maybe the Lancaster connection holds good. There are over 100 alabaster tombs, knights' tombs, surviving, where the effigy has an SS collar, outnumbering hugely those with a Yorkist collar. Now, even in an era dominated by the House of Lancaster, this is quite a statistic. So it does make you wonder whether alabaster becomes a mark of the House of Lancaster, of a duchy retainer. And you could again name particular examples here. One is Sir John Cockayne, and the one I've chosen to show you is Sir Robert Waterton, again a very well-known tomb in Yorkshire in Methley Church. Sir Robert Waterton was duchy official and chamberlain and an executor of Henry IV, and again he gets an alabaster tomb. You could say the same for the Nevilles in Durham, for example, and for many others. So in all of this rather untidy and maybe shifting narrative of what alabaster might have meant as a material signifier, as part of a material culture of a particular age, what I'm suggesting, I think, is that a material can have a significance, a political and cultural significance, but can it also have an English significance? way back in 1955, Nicholas Pevsner thought it could. In his Wreath Lectures, The Englishness of English Art, he associated what he called the long, lean, thin-faced figures in alabaster with the verticality of English perpendicular architecture. So the last question I want to ask is whether English alabaster, as I've already argued with French royal marble tombs, whether English alabaster is a recognisable look that contemporaries would have seen in the way that I think we do now, going into a continental museum and say, oh yeah, there's another English alabaster. Was that something that contemporaries could do? Was this a look that mattered? Was the Englishness of it something that mattered? And again, I'm going to look again at two very well-known documents here. The first is the tomb of John IV of Brittany, which is lost but known from documents and from an engraving. The documents tell us that in 1408, his widow, Joan of Navarre, who was by then married to Henry IV, commissioned an alabaster tomb for him in England, which was then shipped to Brittany. So it's another exported tomb, but in reverse. Rather than commissioned in France and shipped to England, this is now commissioned in England and shipped to France. Culturally, John was English. He'd grown up in exile in the house of Queen Philippa and subsequently the Duke of Lancaster, and had briefly been married to a daughter of Edward III. His second wife was the stepdaughter of the Black Prince, Joan Holland, and the Black Prince had been a key supporter in the struggle over the Duchy of Brittany. He'd been Duke of Richmond and was also a Knight of the Order of the Garter from 1375. And he himself had shown an interest in English art. We have a document of 1393 of him exporting an alabaster statue of St. Michael. And this isn't it, of course, but it's the one in the Ashmolean, which was dug up very, very early, around 1660, in Monmouthshire, and may give us an idea of what this might have looked like. So John had already imported an English work of art for his own use. So what would this tomb have looked like in the Abbey of Nantes, latterly the Cathedral? Would it have looked recognisably English? I think it would. And here we need to remember a few things. One is that it was almost certainly much more heavily polychromed than it would have been if it was French. All the indications, there's not very serious work done on polychromia, but so far as I've managed to go, it seems very likely that the English tombs were more heavily painted. You have the very distinctive tomb chest, which is just like that of Henry IV. And we have our heroic knight, just like the knights of Poitiers and Crécy that we've already looked at. This, in effect, becomes a cultural statement. Brittany is a contested territory, so to have an English tomb very much advertises his alliances in opposition to France, very much the way that Robert the Bruce's tomb had advertised his alliances and claims by culturally drawing on the precedent of France. So a little bit of England in Brittany for very particular political effect, I think. And the last is another equally well-known document, 1393. 4 statues were exported from Southampton, 1382, I beg your pardon, from Southampton by Cosmatus Gentilis, the papal collector of taxes in England. These statues were St. Peter, St. Paul, the Virgin, and a small Trinity. And the 2 statues, English alabaster statues in Santa Croce, have always been associated with this document. Now, it's quite an interesting incident in itself, because it's not the only time that Cosmatus exported works from England. There are other instances as well. He seems to have taken advantage of his position to get off paying export duties, to export luxury goods back to Italy. There are mentions of tapestries exported from Southampton in 1387, for example. Now, I think this is interesting in itself because of the statement going back to the age of chivalry that the English couldn't compete in terms of luxury goods. So this is an Italian who was actually very keen, it seems, on northern luxury goods, including English alabasters. He held a number of titles, but Cosmato Gentile de Migliorati, as his full name was from 1379 collector of papal taxes in England. He was Chancellor of Papua, Provost of Valva, and by 1389 Archbishop of Bologna, all titles mentioned in the English documents. So there's no doubt about who he was. And after his return to Italy, he was made a cardinal attached to, yes, Santa Croce, which is why the connection has been made, and I think rightly, with these two statues. He went on to become Pope briefly, Innocent VII, just for 2 years before his death. Now, why am I raising this again? All of this is relatively well-known ground, even with a little bit more information about Cosmato himself. Well, again, I think it's the political possibilities of these statues, because this is the period of the schism. And the papal schism had got sucked into the 100 Years' War, and the 100 Years' War had got sucked into the schism. So the French supported the popes in Avignon, and the English, not surprisingly, supported the popes in Rome, of which one was Urban VI, the pope for whom Cosmato was the collector. So even now, if you go to Italy and you see English alabasters, and there are a few of them there, even without their original paint, they look immediately very different from the Italian works of art that surround them, and I think these statues would have done too. Alabaster, yes, it looks very much like Italian marble, but Italian marble was not normally painted, and these were. The iconography is very different. St. Peter is represented as a relatively young man. He's not represented that way in Italian art. It would have looked very weird, I think, to 14th century viewers. So these two statues, I think, would have looked very distinctive in their new Italian context, let's say in Santa Croce, where they remain today, though sadly not on view. So just in the way that the tomb of John of Brittany becomes a kind of cultural statement of his political alignment, not with the enemy France, but with England, so these, I think, become a kind of cultural statement of the political alignment of England with the Roman popes and not with those of Avignon. And I could cite other examples of this as well, but I need to stop. So just one final point. And this is going back to Netherlandish carved altarpieces. In 1390, Jacques de Baerze of Dendermonde, or Jacob he should more correctly be called, was contracted to produce 2 carved altarpieces for the Chartreuse de Champmol, the mausoleum of Duke Philip the Bold, in the Duchy of Burgundy. He was paid the princely sum of 400 francs. The Dukes of Burgundy do not seem ever to have commissioned carved altarpieces again. But this particular genre starts just as the genre of English alabaster altarpieces started, at the very top, with the dukes. And the same might be said of alabaster or marble tombs, which also are characteristic of those early Dukes of Burgundy, whatever happens later on. So there's a similar trajectory, I think. And carved altarpieces made in the Low Countries in polychromed wood have dropped out of art history in just the same way that English alabasters did, and for very much the same reasons, dubbed repetitive commercial products. But from the 1380s, a great deal of work has been done to rehabilitate them and to try to understand what this industry, this very thriving export industry, thriving just as much as English alabasters, what this was all about. And I think the similar origins is very important here, that whatever alabaster or carved wooden altarpieces become, they both started at the very top with the rulers themselves. So the final claim, I think, the thing I'd like to leave you with is that it's not just genre and style that matter in art history, it's materials as well. And that was, I think, you can say of alabaster. Thank you very much.